So in this video, we're going to be talking about an introduction to political philosophy. And in particular, the issue that we're going to address related to political philosophy is, does the state have authority over the individual? Does the state have authority over the individual? What is the relationship between the state and the individual? Does the state have the right to intervene? And if so, under what circumstances does the state have the right to intervene upon the liberties of individuals? We're going to look at basically two different answers to that. We're going to look at anarchism, which basically says that the state has no authority over the individual. Then we're going to look at social contract theory, which basically says that the state has authority over the individual because it governs by the consent of the individual. Now, under this idea of social contract theory, after a brief introduction to that, we're going to look at three different varieties of social contract theory. So that's what we have in store for today, and let's go ahead and get started with anarchism. Now, anarchism answers the question of whether or not the state has authority over the individual with a resounding no. And the philosopher that we'll look at here is Paul Wolff, who is our resident anarchist philosopher. Anyway, Paul Wolff in Anarchism basically says that the state does not have authority over the individual. Now, when I was younger, I grew up in the 80s, and so this was the era of punk rock music and things like that. And I recall a number of the punk rock bands that were famous at the time. They had this symbol that was an A with a circle around it, the anarchy, the symbol of anarchy. And of course, punk rock musicians, and the version of anarchy that they espouse is just the idea of throwing off authority and basically doing whatever it is that you want to do. Now, anarchism can be thought of in those terms. However, that's not the anarchism that we find among those who are philosophers and philosophical anarchism, if you will. Paul Wolff explains that the state has no authority over the individual, and the reason for this really is grounded in a distinction that he makes between power and authority. Power and authority. You see, the power is the ability to coerce obedience. Power can be defined as the ability to coerce obedience. In fact, if you break the laws in a state, the state has the ability to come in and either make you obey or do some very bad things to you, right? So they can place you under arrest, they can give you a fine, they can take you to jail, put you in prison, and then ultimately, depending upon how much you want to push your resistance, they can take your life as well. The state has various means at its disposal at making sure that you do what they tell you to do, that you kind of fall in line with their agenda and their rules. So that's what Wolff would describe as power. And the state certainly has this, without question. Now, authority, on the other hand, is something that is different than power. Power is the ability to coerce obedience. Authority is the moral right to be obeyed. The moral right to be obeyed. In other words, you could break the laws of the state. That's entirely possible. But in doing so, you are being an immoral person if you do. Now, this doesn't mean that you get caught. This doesn't mean that you go to jail. This doesn't mean that you suffer any temporal consequences for the actions that you've done. But basically what it means is that you have violated a moral principle if you break the laws of the state. So that would be what would be defined as authority. When one person has authority over someone else, then disobedience to that person is a moral wrong. So there's a distinction between power and authority. Power is the ability to coerce obedience. Authority is the moral right to be obeyed. And Wolff says that the government has power, but not authority. The government has power, but it does not have authority. In other words, the government has the guns and the police and the law enforcement and the court systems. All of these things are resources that the government has at its fingertips to make sure that you do what you're supposed to do. But it does not have the moral right to be obeyed. In other words, what Wolff would say is if you can get away with it, there's no wrong done. There's no negative consequences that you have to endure, and there's no moral thing that has been broken, any moral law or principle that's been broken. So the state has power, but not authority. In fact, it is impossible for us. So basically, Wolf grounds this in a view of the human being or human choices that is related to existentialism. He grounds this in the fact that we are, as moral agents, we are free, completely free to do whatever that we want to do. And the very fact that we are able to break the law would demonstrate that, right? We have the moral ability, we have the ability, the freedom to break the law. And really, with that freedom comes the responsibility to govern oneself. With that freedom comes autonomy, right? If you recall, autonomy is maybe described as one who is self-governed. Autonomos means that you are self-governing, or you are a law unto yourself. So autonomy is something that every human being possesses, says Wolf. You have it, I have it, we all have the responsibility to govern ourselves according to the laws that we have in our own minds, our own moral principles and so forth. We have the responsibility to do that. And here's the thing, whereas social contract is going to say that we relinquish some of our autonomy to the state whenever we decide to come into society, Wolf vehemently disagrees with that. He believes that actually it is impossible for us to relinquish autonomy. It is impossible for us to give up to acquiesce to a higher power, to give up our ability and our responsibility to choose how we want to be. So it's impossible for us to relinquish autonomy, says Wolf. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that we just go about our day and disobey every law with no regard whatsoever to what the law of our state says. In fact, one might choose to go along with the law because at that particular time, going along with the law presents an advantage over breaking the law. And Wolf believes that an anarchist may very well be a very law-abiding citizen if they so choose. But that autonomy, that choosing, always remains the part of them. However, the anarchists might also choose to disobey the law or to disregard the law. And in such a case, they are not morally wrong for doing so because the state has no authority, no moral right to be obeyed. So that's the anarchism of Paul Wolf. And it's a very succinct viewpoint, and it's a very easy to understand one. However, it does lead us with some difficulties, right? What happens, for example, if everybody in society, if no one in society has any regard whatsoever for the laws, and if they're not morally wrong for disobeying them, then what is that going to do to the cohesion of society? Where does the state have the moral right to inflict the punishment, to exercise the power that they have? Is that an immoral thing to do? So anyway, there are some concerns there. And so there are some thinkers throughout history who have said, that is an unacceptable place to be. And one such group of thinkers can be reflected in those who espouse social contract theory. Now, we're going to look at social contract theory, and basically, social contract theory says that the authority of the state is justified by the consent of the people. The authority of the state is justified by the consent of the people. Now, there are many, many, many versions of social contract theory. We're going to look at a handful of them today. We're going to look at John Stuart Mill. We're going to look at Karl Marx. We're going to look at John Rawls, a more recent thinker. But understand that this goes back a long way in early Enlightenment thinking. Thomas Hobbes, and we'll be using Thomas Hobbes's language to really discuss the social contract. But also John Locke. John Locke elaborates on a version of social contract theory that really undergirds the American experiment, the experiment of the American Republic, John Locke was one of the founding fathers' favorite philosophers to quote. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, when writing the Declaration of Independence, almost plagiarizes John Locke. There's so many parallels between the philosophy of John Locke and the content of that document. Jean-Jacques Rousseau does the same thing for France in the French Revolution that John Locke did for the American Revolution, and so there's some nuanced differences there. So anyway, just to point out, saying that all that just to point out that there are many different versions of social contract theory, but they all sort of have the basic a basic outline in mind. And so what I want to do before we get into the three versions that we're going to look at, I'm going to basically give you an understanding of what social contract theory is, a real basic understanding. I'll be using the terminology of Thomas Hobbes in this particular presentation because it's one of the earlier formulations, and pretty much everybody who comes after him utilizes the same terminology, even though there are definitely significant differences between them. But anyway, but the general outline of social contract theory is this. It starts out in what Hobbes would call the state of nature. The state of nature. And the state of nature is a theoretical state of human existence where there are no laws, where there are no morals, where there are no binding moral principles to be obeyed. And so if you can imagine a state of human existence where this is the case, that is the state of nature. That's what Hobbes would call the state of nature. It's a theoretical state of human existence where there are no laws and no morals. People can do whatever they want to do, so long as they can physically accomplish it. Now, this is, I want to point out a couple things about this definition. Number one, I want to point out that this is a theoretical state of human existence. And when Hobbes talks about it being theoretical, what that means is that it doesn't actually ever have to historically exist. It's just a state of existence that you and I could imagine that would be possible. So it doesn't have to actually exist. So there's that. Moving on from there, though, Hobbes says that if we were to get to the point of the state of nature, and we can imagine an entire societal collapse, everybody's basically doing whatever is right in their own eyes, then what that's going to result in ultimately is a war of all against all. A war of all against all. And this is basically because people, when they're left to do whatever they want to unto themselves, well, a lot of people would be, they'd be pretty chill. They wouldn't go around messing with anybody, but there would be a significant number of people who would. And in order to protect themselves from people who who are dangerous during this time, people who are going around and harming one another, stealing from one another, lying to one another, because in the state of nature all of those things are possible, then people are going to be, they're basically not going to be able to trust anybody that they meet. It's going to be, every man for himself. It's going to be a dog-eat-dog world. It's going to be a place where you can't even trust those who are members of your own household. And so it's going to be a war of all against all. It's going to be constantly looking over your shoulder. Life, Hobbes says, will be poor, nasty, brutish, or solitary, brutish, and short. Poor, nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. That's what life is going to result in. And Hobbes believes that we must do whatever is necessary in order to escape this state of events or this state of affairs. So what do we do? Well, people in the state of nature who are in a state of war of all against all, what they need to do is that they need to band together. They need to enter into an agreement, which he calls the social contract, and then in that agreement would entail rights and responsibilities to observe in order to partake of the benefits and protections of society. Now, what do we mean by that? To partake of the benefits and protections of society. Well, we can all agree, I think. It doesn't take much to imagine that life is far better in society than it is if we had no society whatsoever. Even in a situation where governments are despotic and tyrannical, even living under that kind of government, as bad as it is nothing compared to living in the state of nature. The state of nature There's nothing that can happen. I mean, even the most despotic ruler still governs in such a way so as to protect some of the citizens. But in the state of nature, there is no government. You have to look over your shoulder constantly. You cannot accrue wealth because if you do, people will come and take it from you. Really, all that you have is the clothes on your back, and you're not even sure where to get your next meal because there's no supply line set up. There's no supply chain for anything. So you're going to starve most likely. Well, Hobbes believes that that society, even the worst kind of society, would still be better, a lot better than the state of nature. So people enter into this agreement. They come together and they say, okay, I'm going to give up my right in the state of nature to kill or harm other people. And if everybody in society does that, then everybody's laying down their weapons, right? They all agree that it's going to be a moral principle that we give up our right to kill, to harm one another. And so now we've established the ability to come into proximity to one another, and we can start communicating. Well, when we start communicating, we need to give up the right to lie to one another, the moral right to do so. And so we make it a moral taboo to tell lies. And what does that do? Well, that establishes a ground for communication, and we can begin to communicate to one another. And we affirm the right or the morality of keeping your promises, and so now we can build contracts. We then give up the right to steal from one another, and we establish the right to personal property. So now we can accrue mass amounts of wealth and production so as to put it to use to further society, and we can build culture, we can build education, because now we're telling the truth to one another, we're not lying, and all this sort of thing. And so society can get underway. Even, I mean, can we see the much improvement just from the idea of giving up our ability to kill or harm one another, giving up our ability to lie to one another, giving up our ability to steal from one another. If we just do those three things, and of course there are others as well that we can do, but if we just do those three things, we have established the foundation for living in society with one another. So the social contract allows us to do that because the contract is we agree to give these things up. But we need one more thing. Our contract is not finished yet. Because what happens when somebody decides in the state of nature, when they're coming into this contract, they're saying, I'll agree to do some of these things, like the anarchist, right? Because it benefits me. But as soon as it doesn't benefit me, or as soon as I can gain an advantage by lying or stealing or killing or harming, then I'm going to go ahead and do that. Well, what happens? Who's going to stop this person from doing this? Are you going to stop? Am I going to stop? We don't have the ability to stop one another from doing these things because we are all equals. We are all equal with one another. So what ends up happening is that in order to enforce the contract, to make sure that the contract is not violated, what we have to do in society is we have to appoint a sovereign. Now, a sovereign is just a fancy word that Thomas Hobbes uses to describe whoever it is that is at the head of society, whose job it is to enforce the social contract. So the sovereign is one who is not equal with the rest of us. The sovereign is one who possesses both power and authority, governing by the consent of the people to enforce the social contract. He is the one who is that is not equal to the rest of us, who has the authority and the power to enforce the contract. And so now we have entered the contract. We've agreed to certain behaviors that facilitate the functioning of society. And we have appointed a sovereign over us whose duty it is, an obligation it is, to make sure that everybody in society holds to that contract. Now that's all well and good, but there are some who would remark, well, I didn't sign any contract. I was never party to any sort of constitutional agreement. I never gave up my right to harm people, lie to people, and to kill people. So I defy this contract, right? Well, so here's the deal. Here's what Hobbes would say to that, and others after him as well. They would say, look, here's the thing. From the time that you were born, you have lived under the protection and the benefits of this contract. This contract enabled you to be raised. This contract enabled your parents to get food for you, to raise you, to provide for you. And so you have benefited all of these years up until this point where you're thinking about, I didn't sign any contract, you've benefited from the protection and the benefits of society. That in and of itself is your tacit endorsement of this contract, because you have ceded to partake of these benefits and these protections all of your life. Now, you cannot just simply partake of the benefits and protections and then just tell of this contract, the things that this contract provides for your human flourishing. You can't do that and then just say, and then when it becomes inconvenient for you, say, well, I'm not going to obey it. No, you implicitly gave your agreement and your endorsement and your consent to it by living under it and being protected by it. So it is binding on you, and if you don't like it here, I guess you could go somewhere else and live under the contract established in that society, and in that way choose your own contract. However, as it stands right now, your partaking in the benefits and the protections of this is your tacit endorsement of it. So that's social contract. The idea that the government has authority, and that authority is derived by the consent of the people. So now let's talk about different versions of this, or how it's sort of manifested itself, because honestly, the social contract theory is not very detailed as to what kind of government it could possibly eventuate in. Thomas Hobbes went on to justify the divine right of kings doctrine that was so much a part of the Middle Ages and then the early Enlightenment. He went on to justify the divine right of kings, which justified the rule of despots, which could even be used to justify tyrants, and people who have done all kinds of unimaginable evils, unspeakable things like genocide. Hobbes would say, living under a genocidal maniac is better than living in the war of all against all, better than living in the state of nature. Now Locke goes on to say, no, that the government basically is bound, that our rights are unalienable, and meaning that they cannot morally be taken away. And so a government that violates the rights of its citizens is itself a tyrant and then must be overthrown. And so that's why in Locke you find a justification for political revolution. Hobbes, you don't. And so anyway, a lot of different people who have talked about social contract theory have formulated different ideas. We're going to look at three, and the first one that we're going to look at is that of classical liberalism, a la John Stuart Mill. Classical liberalism, the version of classical liberalism that is espoused by John Stuart Mill. Now you'll recall John Stuart Mill, when we talked about ethics, was one of the seminal thinkers in the area of utilitarian ethics. He was the protege of Jeremy Bentham, and he took this utilitarian ethics and he applied it not only to individual ethics, but also to ethics at large, by society at large. And so what we're going to see here is his writing on how to apply the principle of utility to a governmental system, and it takes the form of classical liberalism. Now, classical liberalism justifies government authority on the basis of the principle of utility. Now, you'll remember what the principle of utility is. The principle of utility says that one should do whatever promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. One should do whatever promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. That is the principle of utility. And that's the principle upon which utilitarianism as an ethical theory is founded. Do whatever promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, how Mill takes this then and applies it to a state is he says that the kind of society that promotes the greatest good for the greatest number is one where individual liberty is maximized. The kind of society that promotes the greatest good for the greatest number is the one where individual liberty is maximized. Now, if you think about that, what would you prefer? Think about that for a moment. Would you prefer to live in a state where individual liberty was maximized and yet there may be a little bit of danger, versus a state where your every move is monitored, your every basically the thought police are monitoring how you think, and you're protected from one another, but at the expense of your liberties. Imagine trying to live in the United States versus living in North Korea, right? And Mill would say that most people, the vast majority, once they understood the implications, would want to live in a society where their liberty, their freedom was maximized. So basically, that's what we should form our government on. The government should be formed in such a way that individual liberties would be maximized. Now, out of this, Mill develops the principle of what he calls the principle of liberty. The principle of liberty. The principle of liberty says this. It says the government only has the right to interfere with the liberty of individuals if or when those individuals are going to harm one another. The government only has the right to interfere with individuals if the individuals are going to bring harm to one another. Now, we have to understand what Mill means when he talks about people harming one another, because it's a little bit broader than what we might typically think. Now, when we think about people harming one another, we might have in mind the idea that, somebody physically harming someone, maybe deliberately emotionally harming them, this kind of thing. And those would certainly fall under the harm category. But what Mill is talking about when he says that the government has the right to intervene only when people are going to harm one another is he believes that harm, or true harm, comes from a violation of a person's liberties. So whatever liberties that we have established under society, if someone is going to harm those or bring harm to them, then or violate them, then I am being harmed. So it's not just a physical harm. Physical harm certainly would fall into that category, right? Because if I have a liberty to expect, if I have the freedom to expect that I can walk down the street unaccosted, or live my life in a way that free from violence, then somebody violates that liberty that I have, or that freedom that I have, then I have been harmed. So that would fall into that category. But there are other things that don't exactly result in physical harm that also count under this category of harm. Things like freedom of speech. That if that is my liberty, if that's my civil liberty, my freedom of speech, if I have that liberty, and we'll see that Mill believes that we do, but if I have that liberty, then someone who violates that has done me harm. If I have the liberty or the freedom to worship however I want to, and someone stops me from doing that legislatively, or however that might happen, they impede me from being able to do that, then I have been harmed. If I have the freedom to be free from unlawful search and seizure, and yet someone comes in and searches my house and takes stuff, then my liberties, my freedoms have been violated. I've been harmed. So Mill believes that harm comes as a result of my rights or my freedoms, my liberties being violated. That's what he means by harm. Now, what are some of these protected liberties, these freedoms that we have, according to Mill? Well, Mill believes that there are three core primary areas where we should be able to exercise our freedom. But they all stem from what he calls a liberty of conscience. A liberty of conscience. Liberty of conscience is basically the freedom to believe as you desire. Freedom to believe whatever you want to believe. Freedom to believe in God, freedom not to believe in God. Freedom to believe that the earth is flat or that the earth is a sphere. The freedom to believe, you can believe whatever you want to. People have the freedom to be wrong, and then that's completely fine, so long as they are not bringing harm to others. You have the freedom to believe whatever you want to. Now, stemming from that freedom of belief is what he would call the freedom or the liberty of pursuits. Now, think about this. Are you ever not free to believe whatever you want in your mind? Are you ever not free to believe what you want in your mind? I mean, how could someone stop you from that? if you want to believe in God and you exist in a nation where believing in God is persecuted, you can believe in God all you want to still, because you can believe in God in your mind, and you don't ever have to you don't ever have to voice that opinion necessarily. So the freedom of conscience, the freedom of belief, is automatic. People are going to believe what they want to anyway, no matter what a government says, no matter what someone in authority says, no matter what how much persecution that people who believe like that endure. They're going to be able to believe however they want to, regardless of what the authorities think or say. So how then is that a freedom or a liberty that I'm guaranteed? Well, Mill believes that if we have a genuine freedom or liberty of conscience, then that is going to necessarily imply that we also have a liberty of pursuits. Now, a liberty of pursuit is not only the ability or the freedom to believe how you want to believe, but it's also to the liberty to act upon those beliefs and act upon that freedom. And we have the liberty to do that, because a liberty of conscience without a liberty of pursuits is absolutely nothing. And so Mill believes that we should have the ability to act upon our beliefs as well. The liberty of to plan and live my life however I want to do. Now, also stemming from that, so we have liberty of conscience, the liberty to believe however I want. We have the liberty of pursuit, so we can plan and engage and live our lives however we want to. There's also what he would call the liberty to unite. And this is the idea that we have the freedom to assemble with those people who believe like we do and who want to live like we do. So we have the freedom to do that. So the freedom or the liberty to unite, freedom to peacefully gather with like-minded people. Now, if you look at all three of these liberties, you can see something here that sort of resonates, I think. In fact, it really is a justification of what we find, the various freedoms that we find guaranteed in the First Amendment of the Constitution, the very First Amendment. The First Amendment it guarantees freedom of religion, so the freedom to believe what you want. It guarantees the freedom of the press, which basically is the freedom to talk about what you believe, and then to write it down and disseminate that information. There's the freedom of assembly. This is the freedom to unite together and come together and talk however you want to. The freedom of speech, again, the freedom to express yourself and express yourself in your life. So the First Amendment of the Constitution really is an embodiment of all three of these liberties that we see John Stuart Mill justifying on the basis of the principle of utility. Now, there is a distinction that should be made between what John Stuart Mill is teaching when he talks about the liberty of conscience, the liberty of pursuits, and the liberty to unite, and the freedoms that are guaranteed in the First Amendment of the Constitution. You see, the First Amendment of the Constitution it was formulated on the basis not of civil liberties, but on the concept of unalienable rights or human rights. You see, it was justified on the basis of the idea that we have certain rights by virtue of the fact that we are human beings, and that for a government or anyone else to violate those rights, it is an immoral and in this case illegal thing to do, particularly for the government. Now, Mill, though, does not justify his liberties on the basis of human rights or unalienable rights or anything like that. He believes that the concept of human rights is too esoteric. It's too out there. It's spiritual or mental. It's rational, but it doesn't have any grounding in the real world that we live in. Mill is more of an empiricist, right? So he doesn't justify his civil liberties on the basis of human rights. What he justifies his liberties on the basis of is the principle of utility. And so what we have here are what Mill refers to as civil liberties, not unalienable rights. Civil liberties, not unalienable rights. They are justified on the basis of the principle of utility. And here's the catch, that if something can be justified, or something is ultimately justified on the basis of the principle of utility, right, the greatest good for the greatest number, then those liberties can be removed if they do not promote the greatest good for the greatest number. So, for example, if there's some sort of a national crisis and it is determined by the powers that be that to limit freedom of speech so that people cannot communicate with one another, or to limit freedom to unite together so that people cannot peaceably assemble, then if it proves to be expedient to do so, so as to accomplish the end of this national crisis, then we can just go ahead and remove those. And you might see where that could be problematic, because if we don't have unalienable rights, then the government really is not beholden to not violate our liberties or our freedoms. They can do that if they ever consider it to be politically or pragmatically expedient. So that would be one of the issues with his notion of civil liberties. Now, one has to ask, okay, well, if the government is supposed to maximize the liberty of the individual, certainly we can't just let people do whatever they want, because if they do whatever they want, then people are going to harm one another. So when does the government have the authority to intervene in the life of the individual, to intervene to curtail or limit the freedoms of the individual? And Mill believes that there are two basic conditions, and they're both related. They're actually one condition, but he elaborates on it. But the two conditions for government intervention is, number one, if someone is going to directly harm or bring harm to someone, then the government has the right and the duty to intervene. The government must do so. That's what they're there for. The government must intervene in order to protect people from harm of others, protect others from violating their liberties. So that's sort of the most obvious one. However, there's another way or another time that the government can intervene as well, and it has to do with bringing harm upon people. But the government also has the right to intervene when someone is not performing their civic duties. When someone is not performing their civic duties. Now, the concept of civic duties basically is this: that there are certain things that every citizen is responsible to do, to fulfill, because in doing so they must do these things in order to allow the government to do the work that they do at law enforcement. So there are certain civic duties that individuals must fulfill, and they are required. They can be obligated to fulfill these things, justifiably so, because if everybody doesn't do them, then the sovereign is not appointed. You can't, and we have no government to make sure that the contract is enforced. What are some of these civic duties? Well, for Mill, some of these civic duties, there may be even more, but at least among them, number one is paying taxes, because law enforcement costs money. Making sure that people are guaranteed a just trial, that takes money to do. You've got to hire judges and lawyers to enforce the law. You've got to hire police officers and equip them, train them, provide for them. So all of this costs money, and so it is an equal obligation of all people to provide for this law enforcement endeavor. So they must provide for law enforcement. That is an equal obligation. You must perform your civic duty to pay your fair share. Another thing might be something like jury duty, because if we're going to be tried before a jury of our peers, well, we have to have a jury of our peers in order to ensure the execution of justice. If the government doesn't have that, if people don't participate in that, then justice cannot be enforced, and the whole it comes tumbling down. The whole edifice comes tumbling down. So jury duty is a civic duty that people must do, and if they don't do it, they bring harm upon all of society. Another one might be the draft. If compulsory military service were ever required, of course, providing for the common defense. If we're being attacked and nobody comes to the defense, they must be drafted, right? So if the draft is going to be enacted, people are going to have to comply with that as well. So when people refuse to do their civic duty, those various things that are required in order for our society to function, then that person can be intervened. Their freedom can be taken away by the government. So basically, two conditions: someone is going to harm one another, someone refuses to perform civic duties, etc. So anyway, that is the classical liberalism of John Stuart Mill. That is one version of social contract. Of course, it's seeking to maximize the freedom of individuals. Now, on the other side of the coin, or on the other hand, there's a theory that we'll look at next that doesn't worry about the maximizing of the rights or the freedoms, the liberties of the individual. Rather, it centers on the well-being of the whole. In other words, it's a collectivist theory. Not maximizing individual liberties, but maximizing or seeing or emphasizing the right of the whole over against the individual. The individual is just part of the collective. So anyway, basically in this theory that we're going to look at is called Marxism, and Marxism is a philosophy that was put together by a philosopher named Karl Marx. It derives its name from him. And Marxism feeds into various strains of thought. Socialism clearly gets its philosophical underpinning with Marxism. Communism does as well. Nazism or fascism does as well. That's another form of socialism, and it gets its underpinnings from Marxist theology or philosophy rather. And so we're going to take a look at Marx. What did Marx teach? What did he believe? Now, to understand Marx, it helps if we go back and understand where he got his basic theory from. And this comes from the thinking of an Enlightenment, a later Enlightenment philosopher by the name of Georg Hegel. Hegel was a German philosopher who was responding to some of the critiques by Immanuel Kant and Immanuel Kant's epistemology. But Hegel did so by creating or talking about what he referred to as the dialectic. The dialectic. And the dialectic of Hegel basically says the truth is not found in thesis or antithesis, but in synthesis. Truth is not found in thesis or antithesis, but in synthesis. Now, to understand what he's talking about here, I'll give you an example, and then we'll go through kind of a chart. There's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. A thesis basically is a statement or a proposition of truth. It's what somebody believes. We talk about a thesis statement when writing a paper, and a thesis is basically a proposition of what you believe to be true. Now, when you say that something is true, that is always going to generate, it's going to spawn an antithesis, that which is its own denial. So when you affirm something, that affirmation of a truth is going to create or generate the denial of that truth. For example, if I were to say God exists, that's the thesis. The antithesis of that is God does not exist. And when I say God exists, understand that I am saying something about God which necessarily indicates that the opposite of what I am saying could be said as well. So anytime that I affirm a thesis, understand that is going to generate an antithesis, no matter what. If I say blueberry pie is good, that carries within the thesis, it carries with it the possibility of its own denial, that blueberry pie is not good. So the thesis, whenever we state a thesis, it carries within it its own antithesis. It spawns that antithesis, which is the truth claim to the opposite, right? Its own denial. So if you affirm something, it spawns the denial of that something. If you deny something, it spawns the affirmation of that thing. So if I were to say God is or God exists, the antithesis is God does not exist. And Hegel would say, well, truth is not found in either one of those statements, because when you make either one of those statements, it automatically includes the other statement. Where truth is found is in the synthesis of those statements, when you bring them together and realize how they synthesize with one another. So, for example, if I were to say God exists, the denial of that is God does not exist. The synthesis, if you bring them together, is it would be something like God is becoming. So God is not being. God is not. God is, the thesis that God is being is not true. The thesis that God is not being is not true. Rather, bring them together and God is becoming. Because when we talk about something becoming, what that means is that it is here in some way, shape, or form, but it is not here in the form that it will eventually be. So God exists. Thesis, God does not exist. Antithesis, God is becoming. That would be the synthesis. So truth is not found in thesis or antithesis, but rather in synthesis. So that forms sort of the first level. So if we chart that out, we see thesis, antithesis, bring them together, and that is the synthesis. But notice what happens here, and this is where it gets kind of interesting. When we have the thesis, we have the antithesis, we have the synthesis, which is where the truth is found, right? But here's the issue, though. That synthesis becomes our new thesis, because the synthesis, God is becoming, is itself a new statement of truth that carries with it its denial. So we have a thesis which implies its antithesis, which creates a synthesis, which becomes a new thesis. And when it becomes a new thesis, that is going to imply its antithesis and create a new synthesis. But when we have the new synthesis, I think you can see where we're going here. That new synthesis becomes its own thesis, which implies its own antithesis, which creates a new synthesis. And we could go on and on and on forever. I ran out of slide, though, so we're going to stop here. But you see where this goes, though. This creates a sort of never-ending development of what truth really is, and can we ever reach the end of the synthesis? Well, that was Hegel's dialectic, and I'm not going to go too much further into that. I just wanted to show you the basic outline of it. And the reason that I wanted to do that is because now, whereas Hegel takes this in a direction of pantheism, he takes it in a direction of spirituality. Marx, on the other hand, takes this concept of the dialectic and he applies it to what he calls dialectical materialism. You see, because Karl Marx sees the entirety of human history as a constant dialectic of class struggle. A constant dialectic of class struggle. When we talk about class struggle, what we're talking about is the various social classes, socioeconomic classes that people have inhabited throughout the years. And Marx believes that this is a reality, that economics has played this huge factor throughout the history of mankind. And throughout the history of mankind, we have had this class struggle based on economics that has led to this dialectic. Now, it's based on economics, therefore that's what he calls materialism. It is dialectical materialism. So with Marx's dialectical materialism, he starts out with a historical process. He sees this dialectic as working through history as a class struggle between various different groups. And he reaches all the way back to the classical era, the era of the Greeks and the Romans. And he cites that the class struggle that was going on in that age was between what might be known as the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians and the plebeians. Now, the patricians, of course, were those in society who had wealth, they had influence, they had probably had some sort of political power or standing of sorts. Perhaps they were military, perhaps they were senators, whatever the case may be. Now, the plebeians were those who were the lowest on the socioeconomic scale in his day, and in the Greek and Roman era, in the classical era. And so the plebeians had to depend upon the patricians and the patronage of the patricians in order to survive. Well, as we move into the medieval period, These two classes, the patrons or the patricians and the plebeians, begin to sort of come together. They come together and they synthesize what Marx believes to be the feudal lords. And during the medieval period, the feudal lords were basically landed nobility that the crown recognized and gave them their grants of land, gave them their titles and so forth. And then what would happen is that they would have this tremendous amount of land. They would need somebody to come in and farm it, and so they would gather to themselves a group of serfs, or serfs were kind of like servants, indentured servants. They're kind of like they were people who basically they rented a piece of land from the nobleman, from the feudal lord, and they farmed it. They produced whatever they could, and then they would send in a portion of that produce to the feudal lord. And so the feudal lord basically ended up not working a whole lot, had all these serfs that basically farmed his land for him, and he just kind of sat back and grew fat off of that. Well, as we move from the medieval period into the more modern era, the era that was really contemporary with Karl Marx, what we see happening is the development of another class of people who were not a lord, so to speak. They were not recognized and landed and recognized titles and this sort of thing. They also were not farmers who were renting land from the feudal lord and farming it for him. Rather, they were people who were making a living on their own. They would go out and they would develop a skill or a trade, and they would begin to work on their own. They would develop themselves tools and processes by which to make it more efficient to do their job. And then they would hire people for themselves. Now they were not nobility though, and so this group of people, this is really what gives rise in the medieval times to a sort of middle class that starts small at first, but then as time goes on, they begin to gain more influence. They begin to gain more wealth. They begin to innovate in terms of bringing technology into it, the technology of the day to make tasks more efficient and so forth. And that multiplies the amount of wealth that they're able to accrue to themselves. So while they don't have a technical aristocratic title, still this group of people has wealth, and this wealth becomes a new aristocracy. Karl Marx believes that we transfer at that point from a medieval feudal lord sort of setup to a capitalist society as this middle class gains influence, as they gain affluence, as they come up with better means of production, and they become very, very wealthy. And so we transfer to a capitalist system where this middle class is doing well. Well, what ends up happening then, though, is that middle class then becomes sort of the predominating force in society. They become what Marx calls the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie basically are those people in a capitalist society who own the means of production. So if it's a farmer, the farmer owns the farm, owns the tractor, owns the tools, the implements by which to farm, and that kind of thing. If it's a blacksmith, the blacksmith owns the forge. They own all of the tools that they make things with, and so forth. So various people begin to be these bourgeoisie. Well, as a let's say a blacksmith becomes more famous and begins to take on more and more work so that he gains more wealth. Well, what is he going to do? Well, he's going to apprentice people to himself so that he can then make more money and expand his business and make even more. And that begins to happen. Well, this creates, in Marx's mind, this creates another class division. So the synthesis of the bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie themselves are a synthesis of the feudal lords and the serfs. This becomes, they become the bourgeoisie. This bourgeoisie then is a thesis that inspires its own antithesis in what's known as the proletariat. And Marx refers to them as the proletariat. And the proletariat, what they are, is that the proletariat are the people who do not own the means of production in a capitalist society, but rather they have to sell their labor in order to survive. So these are the day laborers, the contract workers, the wage earners in society. These are the proletariat. There's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and from the perspective of Karl Marx, that's where he was in his day and age. Now, he envisions, though, a future where bourgeoisie and proletariat will be brought together in yet another dialectical relationship, and they will come together and they will form as a synthesis. They will form the communist society. And he believes that that communist society really is going to be the punctuation for this whole class warfare that is pervaded through history. So he believes that'll be the last cycle, so to speak. And what a classless society, or what the communist society will be characterized by, is number one, there will be no class division, because bourgeoisie and proletariat will be brought together. The bourgeoisie, the means of production owned by the bourgeoisie, will be seized by the proletariat, and then everybody will be a proletariat. Everybody will be put into work in service of the collective, which is everybody, right? So that's what Marx envisions. That's the communism that Marx envisions. Now let's go through a few terms that will help us talk about communism and really understand what's going on. Terms that I've already mentioned, but I want to clarify what they mean. The first is capitalism. And capitalism is variously misunderstood by many people. But capitalism simply is an economic theory, or an economic setup in society wherein the means of production in a society are held by people in a private manner. They're held privately. So there are business owners, there are farmers, there are people who own the means of production. Now, what are means of production? Well, the means of production in a society are basically any kind of company, any kind of concern, any kind of organization, any kind of individual who produce something. So it could be a manufacturing concern that produces automobiles or tennis shoes, or it could be a farmer that produces food. Anybody any concern, any company or whatnot that produces something that is then sold to individuals to be used and consumed, that is a means of production. And in a capitalist society, all of those concerns, all of those companies and corporations, they are privately held either by individuals or by corporations. And so they're privately held, privately owned, privately regulated, and privately run. Private individuals do that. The government doesn't have their hands in that sort of thing in a capitalist system. Now, so that's capitalism, when the means of production in society are privately held. Now, another term that we need to be familiar with is one that Marx uses, and that is the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are a class of people in a capitalist society who own the means of production. The bourgeoisie are a group of people in a capitalist society that own the means of production. On the other hand, so these are the ones who are the business owners. These are the major stockholders in a corporation. These are the people who basically make money because they own the business. And a lot of times, particularly in small businesses, what that means is that the small business owner is working his or her tail off in order to make ends meet, in order to sort of eke out a living. But in larger businesses, larger corporations, a lot of times the owners, they don't have to actually have their hands in the business in order to make business there, right? Or to make money there. A lot of times they're just making money by simply giving guidance and direction. Without having their hands in the actual labor itself. Now, the proletariat, on the other hand, this is another term that Marx uses that we've talked about just a moment ago, I mentioned a moment ago, is that the proletariat are those in society who do not own the means of production. Rather, these are the ones who must sell their labor in order to survive. They must sell their labor in order to survive. These are wage earners, hourly workers, contract workers, salaried workers, whatever the case may be. These are people who must sell their labor, go to work for someone else in order to live. Now, how Marx sees this last dialectic triad working. So we've got bourgeoisie, proletariat, and he believes those are going to come together and be and form a communist society. He said he believes that that is quite inevitable in history. In other words, forces in history are going to move us in that direction inevitably. We're going to end up there. He believes that we should help things along a little bit, but we'll get to that later. But he believes that history is going to move there inevitably, and here's why. Because of the very fact that the bourgeoisie makes their money off of stealing labor from the proletariat. And because of this, that is going to totally undermine the capitalist system. Now, here's what he means. Basically, imagine a company that sells widgets. And this company employs, let's say 100 people. In this company that manufactures and sells widgets and employs 100 people, for every single person, they are net, after everything is paid for, after all the supplies have been bought, all of the utilities have been paid, all of the mortgages have been paid, after everything has been paid, for each employee that this business employs, let's say, for example, that it's making $50 an hour worth of production net on every employee. So they're making out pretty well, right? So just speaking in round figures, so what does it mean that what does Marx mean that the bourgeoisie steals money from the proletariat? Well, each one of these 100 workers are proletariat. They're wage earners. These are not the people who own the company, but the company itself makes $50 an hour on every single one of them. So if the company then turns around and pays each individual worker $25 an hour, but each individual worker's labor is worth $50 an hour for the company, then what that means is that the company is taking $25 worth of labor from this person that this person has produced. It's taking that $25 then and just pocketing it and then giving it to the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie is sitting up there and they're sipping margaritas on their yacht, cruising the Mediterranean, while everybody is at work in their manufacturing concern, and they are basically making all of that money, $25 an hour, for every single one of the employees, for every one of the 100 employees. So $2,500 an hour is being made by the bourgeoisie from stealing that labor from the proletariat. Well, that Marx believes to be immoral. He thinks that is immoral. And what's going to end up happening with this sort of a setup is that not only is it immoral for the bourgeoisie to be stealing money from the proletariat and living off of that, right? Not only is that immoral, but Marx also sees that competition between business owners in the same field of manufacturing, who are trying to compete with one another in order to have their product be the one that succeeds. That competition is also going to create some negative consequences. For example, that competition is sort of a dog-eat-dog thing, and as these various manufacturers or these groups compete against each other, inevitably some of them are going to go bankrupt. Some of them are going to go bankrupt, and what happens to the bourgeoisie when their business becomes bankrupt? Well, in order for them to survive, they no longer own that means of production. They become the proletariat, and they have to go to work for someone else. And Marx sees that this is going to be what happens, and the wealth and the means of production are going to be consolidated in the hands of a very few people in society as monopolies are formed, and that wealth that then is just consolidated in their hands. And so these monopolies are formed where you've got corporations that have their hands in a little bit of everything, and they're profiting off of that, and they're being because they're so big, they can be very competitive, and they're putting smaller concerns out of business, and they're becoming bankrupt, and they're going to work for the big corporations. And basically the bourgeoisie is going to be fewer and fewer and fewer until finally the proletariat have had enough. Because what inevitably happens is the greed of the bourgeoisie basically motivates them to retain their wealth, so they keep it all locked up for themselves, and then they go in and they inflate costs of their goods. Because what happens? Well, if you have a monopoly and you're the one that sets the price, they'll set the price at a high rate. Marx believes, and they'll set it at a high rate so that so that most people won't be able to afford it, whatever it is. Maybe it's a car or shoes or whatever, and so people won't be able to afford that. The majority of people won't. And so they won't buy it, so that sales will go down. But in order to keep the profit margin wide, what the monopoly will then do is, instead of lowering the price and letting everybody stay at work and this sort of thing, they'll lay off a whole bunch of people so that they don't have to pay them, and then they'll keep their profit margin high. But this is going to result, at least Marx believes, in armies of unemployed people. Unemployed people who have no safety net in society. And so Marx believes that through the theft of production from the proletariat, through competition and the forming of monopolies and the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, and then through the greed that motivates people to lay off people, or motivates monopolies to lay off people rather than to fix prices or come up with a different strategy, that's going to inevitably mean that the proletariat will have had enough. And in order to survive, they've got to do something. So what do? Well, Marx believes that the proletariat then will eventually respond through communist revolution. Eventually, they're going to say enough is enough, and they're going to go and seize the property, the means of production from the bourgeoisie. They're going to manage it as the people, and they're going to put everybody to work. They're going to put everybody to work in this now state-run organization, or this state-run company. So basically, that's what happens. Communist revolution is when the proletariat seizes the means of production from the bourgeoisie and tries to create a classless society, a society where everyone works and nobody is the owner of the means of production. Now, as I said before, Marx believes that this is going to happen quite naturally if we just let history alone. But the problem with that is that it's going to take a long time, and a lot of people are going to get hurt in the process. So Marx believes that a nation, a society, should make efforts to transition from a capitalist society to a communist society, and he has 10 planks that embody his sort of transition. And so here's what they are: the 10 planks of communism. Plank number 1 is the abolition of all private property. Of course, property is what separates the bourgeoisie from the proletariat. So if we abolish private property and put the property in the hands of the state so that it's controlled and put to the benefit of everyone, then nobody has a leg up on anybody else. Then he says plank number 2 is the heavy progressive income tax. Now, why a heavy progressive income? What is it, and why does he want it? Well, a progressive income tax is a tax that kicks in after a certain livable wage is attained. So a livable wage is basically the cost of living, the index of the cost of living in a particular area. And so once you've passed a threshold of a livable wage, so that you have everything that you need to survive, anything over and above that is going to gradually be taxed at a much higher interest rate, or not interest rate, at a much higher taxation rate. So let's say that $30,000 is the livable wage for, let's say, a family of 4. In a particular area, $30,000 a year. So anything that you make over $30,000 a year would be heavily taxed. And so if you make, let's say, $30,000 to $35,000 a year, let's say it's taxed at 20%. From $35,000 to $40,000 a year, it's taxed at 50%. From $40,000 to $50,000 a year, it's taxed at 75%, and so on. It's going to come in as the person makes more money, they're also going to owe more taxes. And the reason behind this is that basically Marx believes that people should have enough to survive, but anything that they produce over that should be taken and redistributed to those who don't have the means to survive. So that's the idea there. Plank number 3 is abolition of all rights of inheritance. The abolition of all rights of inheritance Obviously, inheritance is one way that the bourgeoisie start out life in it with an unfair advantage against others. For example, Sam Walton, who was the founder of Walmart, who founded the store, worked it all of his life, made it into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Well, by the time of his death, he didn't just pass the organization off to people who knew what they were going to be, knew how to run a business. He passed it off to his children. Now, to be sure, he probably had been training his children from a very young age, and really mentoring them in how best business practices and how to make a better business and this sort of thing. However, he did pass it off to them. He groomed them for it, but then he gave it to them. It was something that they inherited. Wouldn't it have been nice to have been Sam Walton's child, to have your future planned out for you from the moment of your birth, and you were going to be a billionaire if you followed through? Wouldn't that be a great thing? So that was Marx looks at something like that and thinks, well, that's not fair. Therefore, anything that when a person dies, their stuff, whatever's left over, then needs to go to the state to be redistributed among those people who have who don't have anything or who have need. Plank number 4 is the confiscation of all property of immigrants and rebels. Marx understands where people who have these sort of romantic, in his mind, romantic notions of private property may not be too happy with what he's suggesting that you do. So, and he realizes that there'll be people who will rebel against this sort of idea, this idea of communism, particularly those who are wealthy. The bourgeoisie are going to rebel. They're going to use their resources to rebel against this idea. Also, there'll be people who just leave, who up and up leave. They immigrate to another place. He says, well, you know what? Whether they immigrate to some other place or whether they rebel against what the government is doing, either way, we're going to confiscate their property and then redistribute it among those who have need. Either way. So if you leave the communist nation, don't expect to come back and have your house waiting on you. They will have somebody else living there. Well, the fifth plank of communism is to centralize credit in the hands of the state. To centralize credit into the hands of the state. The state has to have absolute control over all things financial, including but not limited to institutions that extend credit. Plank number 6 is that the means of communication and transportation must be held in the hands of the state as well. That way, people will not be able to go from one place to another. When you tell people a job that they have to do, they need to stay in one place. So if they want to travel from one place to another, that's fine, but they have to have permission from the state to do that. Furthermore, means of communication needs to be placed in the hands of the state, because if you have people out there who have free speech to communicate their ideology, you're going to set up a competing ideology to that of the state, and that would undermine the whole communist revolution. So you need to have your communication and your transportation sort of centralized and controlled by the state. Well, the next one is to extend instruments of production to utilize all land. If you go throughout any country, there are sections of that country, that nation, that have where the means of production are there and they're obvious. They're centralized. They're concentrated in one area. But then there's whole vast swaths of land that there's nothing. There's maybe woods, or maybe there's desert, or something like that, where there are no businesses, there are no manufacturing, there's nothing, no agriculture, there's nothing going on. Well, Marx believes that we should utilize every aspect of the land, and so we should centralize planning in order to utilize the land in the most efficient way possible. So extend the instruments of production. You could plop a factory down in the middle of the desert, because there's plenty of land there and this kind of thing. So it's not so divided up between rural and urban, but it tends to sort of just go all over in one gradual going from one place to the next. Everything is evenly dispersed throughout your nation. Then we have what Marx will come along and talk about the equal obligation of everyone to work. And of course, this needs to take place in a communist society. Because if it doesn't, if it's not, and this is a very important criteria, being unemployed would be illegal. Being unemployed will be illegal. They want to find something for everyone to do in order that production can proceed and everybody can have what they need to live and survive and maybe even have a little bit more or something. You see, in a communist system, really there's no incentive to work. Because if you are going to work and you pour in all of your effort so that you make a livable wage, and then anything over and above that livable wage is going to be taxed at a rate that just destroys it's just basically given away. Well, then what incentive do you have to make more than your basic livable wage? So basically, you would go to work and do the minimum amount of possible in order to get by. You would receive your livable wage, and then you would go on with life. You wouldn't try to do more and go over and above and produce extra, because there's really no incentive. There's no reason to do that. So there's no incentive to work in a communist system. Therefore, everyone has to be mandated by law to work. Of course, everyone who's of working age, that is. Communists were some of the earliest people who were against things like child labor and this sort of thing. They saw huge problems with that, and so they did not believe that children should be employed working in things, but they should be educated, and that should be their job. So equal obligation of everyone to work. So mom and dad go to work. Where do the kids go? Well, the kids go to government-sponsored centers, whether it be babysitting or whether it be education. The kids go away to do their thing, while the parents both go away to do their thing, and they all work. Combine number 9. Combine agriculture and manufacturing industries. Marx did not see a very distinct difference between the two. And he believed that if we applied industrial methodologies to agriculture, that we could make work more efficient, and this sort of thing. So combining the agricultural and manufacturing, so you'd have factory farms and things like that. And then the last plank is free education for all children. Free education for all children sponsored by the state. So the state has the burden to educate children at this point. And of course, you want to do that. That's a critically important thing, because Marx recognized that the most dangerous opposition to his ideology was if people are able to teach their children whatever their values were, rather than having them indoctrinated with the values of the state and communist ideology. So he did not want to allow for there to be any sort of competition set up for his own ideology, and so that is that is why he wants the kids all to be educated by the state. So that's Karl Marx and his communism. Yet again, another example of a social contract at work. This time, however, the social contract is based on the collective, looking out for the good of the collective rather than for the individual. Well, we're going to talk about a third one now, and just mention a third version of social contract. And this one is a rather novel approach, or more recent. It was articulated by John Rawls at the end of the 20th century. John Rawls, I think, passed away at the early 2000s, 2003 or 4, something like that. But he was a philosopher who, after a long time of the history of philosophy being really without a voice advocating for social contract, he re-engages the conversation by bringing up his version of social justice, which is known as the equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity. And Rawls believes equality of opportunity is a necessary thing for a just society. That a society that tries to distribute wealth on the basis of individuals who basically can keep whatever they earn, or a society that tries to distribute wealth justly on the basis of making sure everybody ends up with the same thing. Both of those, he believes, miss the point. because we don't need an equal distribution of wealth in terms of equality of outcomes. What we need to do is we need to be focused on the equality of opportunity of people to gain wealth. Now, we'll get more into his specific theory, but what is sort of a fascinating thing about it is the way that he goes about envisioning or justifying this theory. You see, he believes that the one thing in society that really prohibits people from coming to a perfectly just society in doing it is our own personal prejudices, which are based on where we are currently in the society that we live in now. So, for example, I'm a middle-aged white guy. I'm a Protestant Christian. I'm straight. I'm married. I could go down the list. All these things. I've got a master's degree in education. So there's a lot of information about me, right? All of those things sort of figure into to determine how I view the world. So I view the world from that position, and in doing so, if we're considering some sort of societal change, I am going to be very hesitant to consider any kind of societal change that would target who I am based on all of those things, and sort of interrupt my life or harm me in any way. To give you an example of this, I was having a conversation with my grandmother, and this was around a presidential election. I don't remember which one it was right off the top of my head, but we were focused on the primary for the election, and there was a number of candidates who were running in this primary, and so as I was considering, we were just kind of having a conversation about how, who we're going to vote for, and she asked me who I was going to vote for, and I said, I'm going to vote for candidate A, and she kind of looks at me like I'm crazy and says, I would never vote for that person. I could vote for B or D or F, but I couldn't vote for candidate A. And I said, well, Grandma, why not? And she says, well, that particular candidate wants to privatize Social Security and wants to do away with it, or wants to modify it to something that we can't even really conceive of right now. And so at that point in her life, my grandmother was subsisting off of Social Security. She had other means of income as well, but that was a huge portion of her retirement fund was Social Security. And so she really didn't really know what to do. She said, no, I wouldn't want that chunk of money being gone from my Social Security. But here I am, and they say, and who knows what's going to happen between now and then. But if the current rate of insolvency for Social Security continues, it will be insolvent about 5 years before I retire. And so I'm over here like, well, we need to do something about Social Security because I've paid all this money into it. Like, against my will, the government has taken money out of my paycheck every payday from the time that I was 15 years old until now, and it's taken that money. So I need my money back. If I need to have the benefits of Social Security, which right now doesn't look too promising. So here I am. I'm wanting to change it because it threatens me. Here she is. She doesn't want to change it because that threatens her. And so our respective, based on where we're at and who we are, that prejudices us toward trying to see the issue more clearly in order to do something productive about it. Well, Rawls sees that as a huge issue in our society, particularly a society that is composed of such a melting pot of individuals, right? And so what Rawls believes we need to do is we need to get back to what he calls the original position. In order to perfectly create a perfectly just system, we need to get back to the original position. The original position is basically where we imagine the most just society possible. And the way that we do that is we don't know where in that society we will end up. I don't know what my ethnicity is going to be. I don't know what my socioeconomic status is going to be. I don't know what my religion is going to be, my sexual preference, all of these sorts of things. I don't know what those things are going to be at the end of the day. So if we have a group of individuals who don't know where they're going to end up in society once it's all said and done, then they're probably, just out of pure self-interest, going to be very hesitant to create a society that will lock people into where they are. They're going to be more inclined to create a society where people will be able to move around in society if they want to put forth the effort. So Rawls says that we ought to get back to the original position, the position where we don't know where we're going to end up in society, so that we can create the most perfectly just society. Well, how do we do that? Well, we enter what he calls the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance is basically a thought experiment that he asks us to do. And he asks us to try to imagine myself without knowing what my social status is, what my economic status, my educational status, my religion, my gender, my ethnic or racial status. So I don't know any of these things, and if I put myself in the position of somebody who I don't know any of those things about, and then try to think about what I would want society to be like. Now, if we do this successfully, Rawls says, then he believes that everyone would agree on three basic elements of society. If we do it successfully, if we enter the veil of ignorance and arrive at the original position successfully, we should all agree on three basic elements of a perfectly just society. The very first one is, in the most non-negotiable one for Rawls, is that there should be, in a perfectly just society, there should be equality of civil rights and equal protection under the law for everyone. Equality of civil rights and equal protection under the law for everyone. Without that, then this project doesn't even get off the ground. Because here's the deal. If I don't know where I'm going to end up after this is all said and done, if I have equality of civil rights and equal protection under the law, then wherever I end up, I will at least have the protection of law for me, going for me. I will at least have the equal application of the law going for me. I will at least have all the same civil rights as everyone else. Everything will be equal there. So he believes that that there should be an there's equality in terms of civil rights, equality in terms of protection under the law, because no matter where I end up in society, I want those. I want to be protected. So that's plank number one, and it's the absolute non-negotiable one. He believes that without that, a society cannot hope to be just. Number two, though, is this. He believes that in addition to equality of civil rights, there should be an unequal distribution of wealth. An unequal distribution of wealth. Now, why an unequal distribution of wealth? I thought, wouldn't it be better in a society if we had, if everybody had the same amount? Because then it wouldn't matter where we ended up in society. We'd all have the same amount. Well, not quite, Rawls says, because here's the historical and practical reality of the situation. Every time that socialism has been tried, in any context, in every case, it has always led to a very similar outcome, and it is due to a flaw in the system. The outcome has been bankruptcy, mass starvation, and tyranny. And the reason for that is because the flaw in the system, at least one of the flaws, is this. It incentivizes the creation of need. It de-incentivizes production. As a system, socialism incentivizes the creation of need and de-incentivizes production. Now, why does it do that, or how does it do that? Well, here's how it works. Let's say, for example, that I'm 47 years old. So here I am. I'm a little bit older. I have some life experience and stuff, but as far as physically speaking, I'm sort of on the downhill slope, right? Let's say that I'm employed at a job together with another guy who is 22 years old. And this 22-year-old guy is a very, very healthy young man. He's a single guy, just kind of moved out from his parents' house not too long ago, and now he's trying to get a job and make some money to provide and all this sort of thing. Of course, in a socialist system, there's an equal liability of all to work anyway, so he has to get a job. So he's employed right next to me, and our job is that we are ditch diggers, and we're digging a ditch. And in fact, we dig the ditch, and we're doing it by hand. And he works circles around me because he's younger, because he's stronger of body. He has no problem digging twice the volume, twice the cubic yards of dirt than I do. And so that's what he does every day. Every day he's digging twice as much as I am, twice as much as I am. I have to stop every once in a while and get a breather because or do some stretches because my muscles are aching, or just take a break, or whatever. But he's digging twice as much as I am every day. So productivity-wise, production-wise, he's producing twice as much as I am. So at the end of the week, who gets paid more? Who gets paid more? Does he get paid more, or do I get paid more? Now, some people would start by saying, well, you guys, since it's a socialist system, you guys get paid the same. But not so fast. Not so fast. This is a socialist system, but there is a difference between he and I, aside from just our ages, right? You see, because I have 6 children at home, and he doesn't have any children at home. He doesn't have to care for six kids. I do. Therefore, at the end of the day, in a socialist system, everyone works to the extent of their ability. He can work and produce twice as much as I can. But everybody is paid not according to what they've produced. They're paid based on what they need. So I'm going to have a far larger paycheck than he is at the end of the day. He's only going to get maybe a fourth or a fifth of what I get paid. And yet he's working twice as hard, or working just as hard, but producing twice as much as I am. So where's the fairness of that? Now, what's he going to do after he sees our paychecks and compares them? Well, he's going to reevaluate his priorities, isn't he? The first thing he's going to do, because it's the first thing that he has opportunity to do, is he's not going to work nearly as hard as he was before. He might start taking breaks with me. We might be able to be good friends. We can chat a little bit more often. But his productivity is going to trend downward. He's not going to produce nearly as much. Why would he? What would be the point? Because no matter how much or how little he produces, he's going to get the same paycheck no matter what. So you might as well not just break your back and this sort of thing, to do all the work that you can. You might as well just relax a little bit, and you're going to get paid the same at the end of the day anyway. Well, now think about the effect that sort of attitude or that sort of approach has society-wide. It leads to a decrease in production in every area of society, because why do we want to work so hard? We're not going to get compensated for it anyway. Anything over and above a livable wage just goes to feed my neighbors, goes to feed the person down the road that can't work nearly as hard as I can. So why would I bother in working harder? Why would I pursue something that's intellectually challenging? Why would I do that? I have no incentive whatsoever to do it. So socialist systems de-incentivize production. And when you do that society-wide, then basically what you have is a society full of people who are producing less, and there's less, therefore less resources. There are less resources to go around. So that's one effect. It de-incentivizes production. On the other hand, when he gets his paycheck and I get my paycheck, and he finds out that the reason that I get paid 4 times the amount that he does is because I have children, is because I have need, I have mouths to feed and kids to be educated and clothes for them to wear, so I get paid a whole lot more than he does. Well, if he's halfway intelligent, what is he going to do? He's going to go out and find himself a wife. He's going to start having kids. In other words, what he's going to do is he's going to create need for society. He's going to be involved in the creation of need so that he can get more stuff. So that he can. That's what gets him paid more at the end of the day. So if you want more, you have to create more need. You don't have to produce more. You have to create more need. And so now, if you do that society-wide, so you have people who are creating more mouths to feed, and then on the other hand, people who are who are trending downward in production. You have a perfect storm, and that's what has happened with every socialist, every communist society that historically we've ever seen. The only time that they might start out very well, because everybody's bought into the ideology. But a few years in, things start trending downward. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of Ronald Reagan gave great speeches. The Soviet Union collapsed because it was insolvent. The Soviet Union collapsed because it went bankrupt. It could no longer afford to sustain itself because of the socialist policies. On the other hand, China tends to survive because they have opened themselves up to a more capitalist economic system in terms of the world trade. So it has expanded its market out and become capitalist on the world scene in order to bring more wealth into China. So Rawls sees this. He says, look, socialism does not incentivize production, and what ends up happening is that if you have a society that is struggling economically, everybody is affected. Whereas if you have a society where there are variegations of income levels, an unequal distribution of wealth, but it's a society that is incentivizing production and incentivizing and not necessarily incentivizing the creation of need. If we have that kind of society, then there's going to be an overabundance of production, and that's going to benefit everybody at the top all the way to the bottom, because it's much better to be somebody at the low end of the socioeconomic scale in a nation that economically is doing well, because you can always count on, or usually count on, someone or somebody coming along and giving you help, because more people have the ability to help people. So he believes in unequal distribution of wealth. Therefore, that basically gives you a ladder to climb, and you can climb however high you feel comfortable on that ladder. If you want to climb up to this economic scale, and that's all you want to do because you don't want to put forth any effort, you just want to enjoy life at that level, man, go right ahead. But if you want to keep on progressing up the ladder and producing more, knock yourself out, because that's not just going to benefit you. That's going to benefit the entirety of the rest of society as well. So an unequal distribution of wealth implies that there is an incentivization for productivity, and that's going to benefit everybody in society. No matter where I find myself, I can always climb the ladder. I can always move up. So that's Rawls' second plank there. So equality of civil rights, equal protection under the law, and an unequal distribution of wealth. But then he comes in with this third idea that he calls the redress of nature. The redress of nature. And the redress of nature basically is the idea of the liability of all to create opportunity for those at the bottom. The liability of all to create opportunity for those at the bottom. And here's what he means. If I don't know where I'm going to end up in this society after it's been created, I might very well find myself at the bottom, socioeconomically and every other way. If I find myself at the bottom, just out of pure self-interest, I will want a means to climb the ladder, to do better for myself, to provide for myself better, to move up the ladder. And but in a pure capitalist system, there's no safety net. There's no guarantee that I'll ever be able to do that. And so Rawls believes that everybody who participates in society should have a liability to create opportunity for those who are at the very bottom. Now, what this means is that we don't necessarily tax those in order to redistribute wealth, as in the form of a check, like a communist nation might have us do. Rather, what we ought to do is tax those who make more. We should tax them, yes, but we should take that money and we should take and use it to create opportunity. And by that, he means things like public libraries where people can go and study. Maybe we can subsidize different schools. We can develop schools better. Maybe we can subsidize maybe a college education or something. Whatever it is, it could be meals for those. It could be childcare for moms who have to work and who are down there struggling. They have to work. It could be free childcare. It could be maybe housing of some sorts. Anything that would help provide a person an opportunity to better themselves. Educational grants, communications and cell phones, things like that, so that people can go to job interviews and whatnot, could get called back for that. Anything that creates opportunity for those at the very bottom, all of society, we as members of society who have done better, should be able to chip in a little bit in order to create those opportunities, whatever they may be. So that's what Rawls calls the redress of nature, and he believes that we ought to be involved in that sort of thing because just out of pure self-interest. If we were to formulate a perfectly just society without knowing where we're going to be in it, and if we must imagine the possibility that we're going to be at the bottom, and if we're going to be at the bottom, we want a way to work our way up out of that place and work our way to the top. So that would provide that opportunity for us. So that's Rawls' version of social contract. And with John Rawls, we complete our look at our survey at the various differing forms of social contract theory that the book mentions and that we'll be looking at today. Be sure to check the syllabus, make sure that you get all your work in, do the quizzes and whatever else is required on this module, and we will see you at the next one. Bye-bye.